As far as the self-sufficiency is concerned and China's push in technology, we heard from Jensen Huang recently talking about market share in the market going from 95% to 0%. Do you think that the restrictions being imposed by Western countries, namely the United States, that this is helping China's self-sufficiency push?
For sure. I think history tells us that every time that the U.S. has tried to use export controls to constrain China's development has only led to an acceleration of domestic innovation in China. We can go back to the 1950s and efforts to stop China from developing nuclear weapons. We can look at China's space launch industry, their GPS. So what we're seeing now is counterproductive for the United States. Jensen Huang's been a very good advocate for this point, and it's possible that President Trump is buying into this now because he has hinted that he might be willing to relax some export controls when he sits down with Xi Jinping next week.
We're going to be watching that very, very closely as President Trump makes his first trip to Asia as the leader of the country. I want to ask you about domestic consumption because this is key as well. This is how they are looking to support the economy now through household spending. But how are they going to be doing this beyond subsidies? What are they doing to boost consumption? Of course, we do have the Singles Day shopping festival going on right now with Alibaba. It used to be just one day when it first started 17 years ago. Now it spans longer than a month. What are they doing to boost consumption?
Well, companies will continue to do things like what you talked about with Alibaba, but I don't think we should expect the Chinese government is going to do anything bold or dramatic to promote consumption. But this isn't because they're anti-consumption. I think there's two ways to look at the consumption story in China. And most people are focused on looking at it from the perspective of the final consumption share of China's GDP is very low. But I think that's only a partial way of looking at it. It largely reflects the fact that investment's been driving growth for so many years. The growth rate's been really fast off a very high base, squeezing out the share of consumption in GDP. But the other way to look at it, which I think is more interesting, is that the growth rate of final consumption in China over the last 15 years has been really rapid. It's been much faster than, say, in the United States or in Japan. So this is not a government that's anti-consumption. And while consumption growth has slowed, as wage growth has slowed and the overall economy has slowed in recent years, it's still growing at about 5%. So it's not that bad.
What about its anti-involution campaign? This has to do with excessive and irrational price competition, which also leads to deflation. We've seen this, of course, across electric vehicles, solar panels. What is it doing in terms of trying to edge out this price competition, these price wars?
Well, first, I think it's important to distinguish that we have significant deflation in China's industrial sector. The purchasing price index for industrial inputs is down about 3% year over year. It's been down about that much for each of the last couple of years. But from a consumer price perspective, we have very low inflation, mostly driven by food, but non-food prices are actually up a little bit in China. When it comes to the anti-involution campaign, I think this is going to continue, but I think it's not going to have a significant impact, and we're going to continue to see strong price pressure, strong margin pressure for Chinese companies. So far, all we're seeing in terms of the anti-involution campaign is a bit of an impact in one sector, solar, a little bit in steel, but not much. And one of the differences between trying this now and, say, 20 years ago in China is that it's now a private sector-driven economy. 90% of urban employment is small, privately owned companies. All the innovative companies are private. And it's not so easy for the government leadership to push those people around anymore.
Another policy that we've been tracking ever since President Xi took office back in 2012 is his anti-corruption drive. Just ahead of the plenum, we saw 9 of his top leaders, top brass from the PLA being excused. They are under investigation. What is he doing about this, and is there a lot more corruption that needs to be weeded out?
Well, like the anti-involution campaign, which is going to continue, I think the anti-corruption campaign is going to continue as well. And you could argue that that is having a greater impact on the Chinese economy than the anti-involution campaign. What I heard in China from companies and from economists last month is that the anti-corruption campaign is leading government officials at state-owned enterprises, local governments who are involved in procurement to focus solely on getting the lowest possible price, squeezing prices lower from their suppliers. And even if a company is not selling directly to these government agencies, its customers may be, and they're putting pressure on the lowest price, ignoring things like quality. So I think this is contributing to the industrial deflation and is going to continue in the next couple of years to putting a lot of pressure on margins and profits.
What is your take on a common prosperity? I haven't talked about this lately. It is using its policy to bolster social equity as well as economic equity. How is this impacting his economic policies and affecting business activity?
We don't hear those words very much anymore, common prosperity, but I think the intention and the policies are still there. And when we hear the communique in the next couple of days from the fourth plenum and we see the preview for the 15th five-year plan, I think what we're going to hear about is language along the lines of investing in people rather than just investing in physical infrastructure. So I think we're going to continue to see strong spending on education, on pensions, on R&D. And this is one area where the Chinese government is distinguishing itself, moving in an opposite direction from the U.S. government, which wants to compete more with China, but is cutting back on spending on R&D, science, and education. This is something that I think is important for longer-term investors.
What policies, if any, are being impacted by the ongoing trade war? I'm just seeing some lines come through here, so I just want to bring everybody up to speed. We're hearing from the Japan Chief Cabinet Secretary that U.S. President Trump will visit Japan from October 27th to 29th, and that President Trump will meet with the Japanese Emperor Takaichi during his Japanese visit. Of course, the expectation is that he will also meet with the new prime minister that was just elected just yesterday. I want to ask about President Trump and President Xi, this highly anticipated meeting that they're going to be having next week, and the implications for the policies that President Xi has on the economy. How are they affected when it comes to trade? This diversification of trade networks, how is he navigating these trade tensions?
Well, I think the trade tensions with the United States have persuaded Xi Jinping to double down on the strategy that has been pursuing for some time, which is to focus on the domestic demand side of the economy, which is the biggest part of the Chinese economy. So all those things that we just talked about, investing in infrastructure, investing in power transmission and distribution system, investing in science and technology, promoting the development of things like batteries and AI. But we should also recognize that the impact of the U.S. tariffs and export controls has probably been harsher on the U.S. economy, on U.S. consumers and companies than it has been on China. And I think that President Trump understands this. And I think this is why he's determined to meet with Xi Jinping on the margins of APEC and come up with a deal. He understands that he needs to get China buying soybeans again. He understands that he needs China to continue to sell rare earths. And I assume he understands this is going to mean some compromise on his part, lowering tariffs, stopping with the additional export controls.
I want to get your interpretation because there was an announcement earlier this week that the lead trade negotiator, Li Changgang, he was removed from his WTO post. Now, what does that mean? Some are saying that this is a promotion rather than a removal from another body, of course, the UN body as well as the WTO. What was your take or your interpretation of this announcement?
The announcement was just a bureaucratic move. He left his WTO job many months ago to take a more senior job as the lead trade negotiator globally for China. So I think some media outlets in the United States were following up on Besant's criticism of him, but it's a non-story. I think what's more interesting is that I would argue there's a 70% chance of a deal between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. The 30% wild card is just that President Trump is often mercurial, and also there hasn't been a great deal of preparation by the two sides heading into what's likely to be a relatively short meeting. But 70% is still pretty good. So then the real question is, how much of a deal are we going to get? On one hand, it could be a very basic deal, which is to continue rolling over, deferring the even higher tariffs, maybe an agreement on the U.S. side to not put more export controls in place. And in return, China will give President Trump his much-loved TikTok and also agree to continue buying soybeans and shipping rare earths. But hopefully for investors, for global companies, for American consumers, hopefully there'll be more to it. Hopefully there'll be something that will lead Donald Trump to come back and rein in his hawks and convince his MAGA followers in the U.S. that a collaborative, cooperative economic relationship with China is in the best interest of U.S. companies and consumers and investors.
So can I get your guess on what you think the tariff rate would be? So he's added 100% by November the 1st. What do you think it will be?
Oh, I think he just threw that out there. Right now, officially the tariff rate in the U.S. for goods from China is about 135%. The effective rate right now is about 58%. My assumption is Xi Jinping is going to say to Donald Trump, I'm not going to sign a deal with you unless we get a substantially lower tariff. And by the way, you're only taxing imports from Taiwan 20%. You got to bring us down to something pretty close.